Radio YRE, radio of the communicators of the solutions. Welcome to our Bucharest studios this afternoon, live for the 20th anniversary of Young Reporters for the Environment. We are here sitting on this table, and my invitee today is Mr. Pedro Marcelino. And Pedro Marcelino, you have been the first YRE student. So let us know, how do you feel today being here for the 20th anniversary? And first and foremost, what happened to you at that time? How did that all get started?
Well, first of all, I'm not the first YRE student. I'm not sure you... I might have killed all the other younger students so that I'm the first one. No, there's a bunch of YRE students ahead of me. I think maybe 10 in a couple of missions before mission Antarctica. I might have been the only one that stuck around. And so for all effects and purposes, I am the first YRE student, right? And I like it because I'm being called a VIP, so it's all good. How did it get there? I think it's interesting to think about the fact that in 2015 we are now all over the world. We have the US and Canada and a bunch of other countries. We have Kazakhstan, Israel. Well, in the 1990s, and this is really important, I'm a product of the 1990s. I grew up in the 1990s when we were doing something called European construction. We were building European identity. I am actually the first generation, and maybe some of you are from the same generation, the first generation that grew up as European since the war. We are the first generation that grew up thinking that I'm Portuguese, or I'm Dutch, or I'm Swedish, and I am European. In my professional life, I left Europe. I worked in Africa and in Latin America, and the funny thing is that because of the 1990s, I get back to Europe, and I land in Amsterdam, or in London, or in Paris, or in Rome, and I feel completely at home. Clearly, there are differences, but it became part of what we are. Things have changed a little bit since 2000. We've had 3 economic crises in a row, and now everyone is fighting with each other, and so things have gone down the drain a little bit, which happens sometimes. It's like marriage, you know, it goes up and down. But in the 1990s, we were going through specific things, and that's what's perhaps relevant. We had European programs that were promoting the teaching of languages, of foreign languages, to all students. So everyone was expected to learn a couple of foreign languages. Everyone was incentivized to maybe go on an Erasmus program to another country and take a year off their school and go to another school. We had interrails that were becoming very common. So rite of passage for a lot of European kids of my generation. Grab a ticket for a month and go and travel in Europe on your own without your parents. A few years later, we got low costs. Thank goodness for Ireland that offered so many low costs to us and now everyone else, right? And all those facts end up qualifying pretty much what was happening in the 1990s that YRE was so relevant for, because YRE comes in the wake of all those things. It comes as part of the foundational principles of European identity. We were invited to share a project with other kids because that was part of the project. That was part of learning about others while doing something that had other objectives that we'll talk about. And I believe that even now when we are talking about YRE in the wider world, this is relevant. We're talking about the same principles. Without those guiding principles in the 1990s, in Europe, that would have not, the project would have not achieved the status that it has now. And so I think it's important to perhaps go back a little bit to those ideals of experiential contact between students, because that was at the center of what YRE was in the 1990s. And when I look back at YRE, I think about it as part and parcel of that process. What about you? You are identified here. I'm not sure if you, Philippe has a linguistic issue here. He is identified as YRE creator, which is something very metaphysical. And he suggested that he should be a YRE inventor. So I explained that in English it's kind of weird because inventor is mostly technology, and this is not really technology. But how do you feel about being the creator? It's very omnipotent.
Yeah, I'm feeling so important. No, what happened to me, I was saying with the Loth earlier this morning that I was stubborn and passionate, and maybe that's what was characterizing me the most when I was 19, 20. I mean, in this time where you are facing the world and you are upset about a number of things, and you say, okay, maybe it's possible to make a difference, and you really believe you're able to make a difference as a young people. And I have to say to Pedro, I am so sorry, but I was the first young reporter. Because if it happened to me at that age to initiate this project, it is because when I was in secondary school at the age of 15, I was involved as a young reporter in a very innovative project at that time in Africa. I was sent in a mission in Africa. And that was a turning point of my life, and the seeds that were germinating at that time when I was 20 years old and crossing this with the building up of Europe, as Pedro said, and some opportunities that I was having in Paris at that time with European meetings of teacher training institutes. I was connected by some kind of chance with Europe at that time, and it was like a shock. I was discovering the diversity and the richness of European cultures, especially confronting my Latin background to Nordic countries, which in terms of education see things in a completely different way, the relationships between teachers and students, relationship to time, to hierarchy, to guidelines, to the curriculum. All these things were very, very challenging. And then what happened is that Phi was just getting born at that time. And it was like maybe 2-3 years old. The French office of Phi created in the same time, just a few years after the initial, very first Phi office in Holland. And I was looking for money to make a project about ozone. It was not ozone research. It was not yet called Young Reporters for the Environment. But I was looking for money to send and to connect groups of schools with scientific research in the Arctic about ozone. And this organization opened the door and told me immediately, we have no money, but we like your idea and we can find money together. So that's how everything started with the very, very roots of Young Reporters. And you have to remember that in terms of Europe, and I will come back to that at the very end of this radio show, this press review. We are going to share with you a press review in a minute. I will come back to a very important point, which is what Europe was 20 years ago. And I am particularly happy that this anniversary is taking place in Bucharest, or as it could have been in any other eastern part of Europe. So this context of the building of Europe has been a very, very big component of why we were initiating this project, to make young Europeans from the West and from the East get to know and to cooperate with each other. So that's, kind of on the personal perspective, how things have been.
But on the institutional perspective, there were guiding principles when YRE came to.
Exactly, and And what we are going to share with you for the next 30 minutes, maybe about, is a very interesting press review back into the 90s. So I've been digging into the archive of young reporters for the environment, and Pedro and me, we have been reading again those papers and newsletters and magazines and all that from the earlier times. And what was going in this project? So let's maybe start with this very, very first YRE flyer in French, which was presenting young reporters for the environment. I have older documents actually, even before that one, but this one is the first, so to say, public document. And here you have a small text and a few keywords, and I will read them because they are very, they connect a lot with what you are doing today and what is being discussed this morning and all that. So young reporters, I will translate from French, so maybe it's a bit... Young Reporters for the Environment is a European network of secondary schools. Pupils investigate on environmental and scientific issues faced by their region. Beyond school walls, they go meeting local stakeholders, companies, municipalities, research centers, the public, etc. They communicate their findings on the internet. The word internet was already there in this paper. Beyond the borders. And they present their results to the public in partnership with the local press. So to say, everything was from the start pretty well stated. And then there is this keyword, internet adventure, which is a word that we did not hear so far today, I think. Mm-hmm. Did we? Maybe not. No. Yes, did we? No. Europe, journalism, science, investigation, and mission. So these kind of were the fundamentals in the start.
So if I pick up on those things and you go back to what I opened with, think about this. 1996, the internet had been around for, 3 years. Before that, of course, universities had it, military had it, governments had it. High school students didn't really have internet. Our computers were working on dial-up, for goodness sake. I don't know if you remember, right? 30 minutes to send an email, you know. So the internet was being pushed as something that was part and parcel of our development. Adventure. Imagine being 15 years old, being 16 years old, being 17 years old, and being sent to Senegal, to Vietnam, to the Arctic. Imagine that for a second. I mean, some of you had kids in Portugal just a few months ago. They were there for 3 days. They were pretty stoked at the end of it, crying and all this when they had to say goodbye. Now, multiply that by 4 in terms of length, add some snow, polar bears, boats, flying to Africa. Think about it for a second. Europe. Again, we go back to European construction. We were talking about all the things that you need to do when you are aiming for some wider ideal. You have to learn and know stuff in order to love stuff. So you need to know your neighbors in order to have a shared sense of identity. And that was part of what we were asked to believe in the 1990s. Journalism, so we were obviously being taught how to be journalists. I heard here before that we don't expect professional journalists. Of course not. But let me tell you that not just a few of us have become journalists. So there is something to say about the fact that we are looking for specific things. Science, not a few of us have become scientists either. Nor not just a few of us. You translated this as investigation. It's actually research.
No, it's investigation.
Well, yeah. But in research maybe, and I'll pick up on something that that Margarita mentioned earlier, the fact that when we had a link to research back then, right? And perhaps this is an important link that over time has been slightly lost, and perhaps that's not the ideal. Perhaps we need to start looking again at having a strong link to researchers that are working on the ground, and integrate that with what YRE is doing. And most importantly, of course, the mission at the end, which links back to the adventure.
Right.
And speaking of internet, of course, there's, was this the first website?
That was the first website.
This is the homepage of the first YRE website. You know, you probably wouldn't waste 2 minutes looking at this nowadays.
But we were very proud, and it was designed by France Telecom, who had given us a lot of support to make this very first Young Reporters website.
And we have here, I don't know how Philippe got hold of a Portuguese flyer.
Well, this is a clin d'oeil, as we say in France, because Guida invited us to Lisbon, and I found also in my archaeology of Young Reporters this Portuguese flyer for the earlier times. But then let me go back a bit more into the past, because I found this very interesting project called Réseau Jeunes Reporters d'Europe pour l'Environnement. Young reporters, European young reporters for the environment. That was the very, very first document, which was submitted by Mr. Thomas Joly, director of the French FI, and myself as Ozone Project manager at that time. And in this document, which is dated 26 October 1992, so this is the very first mention of it in a FI document, and this was taking ground on the experience of this ozone project that I was running as a student in 1991-92, and proposing to make a new European program for FI, which at that time was only having the blue flag. And Eco-Schools at the same time was also getting structured as a new international program. So maybe just one or two quotes here. So young reporters would develop in the whole Europe groups of pupils and teachers, proposing them to study thoroughly environmental issues through field inquiries. So again, this idea of going to the field, and in connection with these field inquiries, intensive missions allowing the most eager pupils to analyze during 10 to 20 days in situ the scientific research connected to their topic of investigation. That's one quote also of the initial spirit, connecting, as Pedro was saying, the scientific research and putting young reporters in the heart of where scientific research is happening in connection with environmental issues. And then there is a small thing about teachers here, and this I'd like to highlight it. So it was about what could be the motivations of teachers in such a project. The motivation of teachers could be to make traditional teaching more rich through project-based methodology in a transdisciplinary thematic approach, confronting school to the real world and empowering pupils by the need of autonomy and dépassement de soi, how you say that? Going beyond your limits somehow. And then also opening themselves, the teachers, on the diversity of educational approaches and school systems in Europe. because the diversity of our school systems in Europe is a source of complication when you make schools from different countries work with each other, but it's also a source of inspiration. You have, I mean, a lot of things that in your own single school system you think are impossible to do, for example, and then you start working with a teacher in another country that precisely is able to do it. So it challenges your mental barriers as a teacher. So let me go on with this quick press review. With now 14th January 94, there is this proposition by FI to the Commission, to the European Commission, to organize the first meeting setting up these young reporters for the environment, and the first national operators meeting, which took place in Luxembourg in 20th of June 1994. So that's the real birth date of the project. And let me see in the names that I see here. I think that no one in this room was there. Clara Brandao from Portugal was there.
My old teacher, by the way.
Yeah. And I even have with me, so we will put that on the tables and you will look at that after in the break. This is the letter, the official letter I got from the EU to invite me and all the participants got it to that meeting. It's interesting to see that it was an official European Commission meeting. It was, I mean, as a political will of the Commission to launch this program. And I also have the original speech of the FI president, Mr. Ole Løvig Simonsen, at that time. And he was saying one very important point to remind to Wrigley. Young reporters involve schools not as an end in the transmission chain, but as a tool for reaching the general public through the young people in a different way than the usual channels. So this is already important. And he was also highlighting that this was a project to foster change of behavior and lifestyle. Do I have 2 minutes left for a quick overview of the first newsletters of young reporters for the environment? And this one is the one announcing the birth of the project. So this was right before the Luxembourg meeting. And maybe few quotes from there also, from the editorial, again, by Ole Løvig Simonsen, the Danish FI president. A fascinating dialogue between young people and research scientists during some of the most exciting moments in the adventure of knowledge. So again, this connection with knowledge and science was strongly highlighted. School has more than ever to be interesting and to foster a desire to learn. School must have adventure and action, be up to date and international, have a multicultural approach and be open to contemporary issues. Well, maybe, okay, there are a lot of things about communication. Maybe we speak about that separately, because communication at that time was so funny and so painful. Yeah, so that was some of the, there I had some important quotes also about what inquiries means for young reporters for the environment. And so investigations aim at looking for information beyond school boundaries, and in particular by meeting with persons directly involved with the issues under study. So this idea of a direct connection between the young people and any stakeholder was very important. And young reporters communicate regularly with each other. And as a conclusion to an inquiry, young reporters write their article in a journalistic style. Any reader with no knowledge of the topic should be made to feel concerned and be informed at the same time about the topic itself and about the way the students investigated it. And inquiries should include an extended channel of communication with the local community. So all those connections, as you see, putting the learners in touch with where the knowledge is being produced and delivering it, sharing it with the broader community was at the heart of the project at the start. So Pedro, you have these YRE magazines in the hands, so let us know about what are these magazines?
Well, so you will be very interested in looking at this vintage item here. Look at the font, and this is totally 1990s. This is the first YRE magazine. Someone today said something about having something on paper to show to sponsors. This is what we had back in the time. This is where our articles ended up. This is the very first one. And the very first one is quite interesting because A, it's the first one, and B, is completely dominated by Denmark. Because the Danish were in charge of it. And so, because email was not that simple at the time, it was much easier to just get what was there. So there's a couple of things from other places, but it's mostly one high school in Denmark and a couple of other high schools that participate. And there was an interesting quote here at the front. It says, "Young reporters for the environment inspires to learn from one's own experiences, to become more involved, to participate in events, to communicate and to act. The youth is our future. It is important that the students are critical about what happens in our society and know that their actions can influence the future. The aim of the project is to give the students an awareness of the fact that a change in behavior and lifestyle with sustainable use of resources is an alternative and a possibility not only in the school but also at home." Think about the fact that 20 years ago we were just roughly out of Rio 1991. You know, we were just starting to talk about climate change. Crazily enough, there's still people around saying that climate change is not true, and et cetera, et cetera. But at the time, this was kind of groundbreaking. There were people finally finding a quorum to their ideas that we were affecting the environment and that we needed to do something about it. Now, this first magazine is quite interesting interesting and quite diverse in terms of themes. So we're talking about everything from energy to the oceans to biogas to natural conservation, etc. But then we get to the second magazine. And on this second magazine, and let me look at my cues, it's already interesting because we had a few countries involved at the beginning. And lo and behold, my school was right there at the beginning. And it says something about the microclimate in Sintra. And the interesting thing is that this article is more of a presentation of what the project was in the local school. We are the school such and such, in the place such and such, and we have a microclimate and blah, blah, blah. And this is what we're doing about this, this research. And we're going and talking to experts. So it's very, it's almost like a declamation of what's going on. We are the students from the school and we are doing this, pretty much in the same line as this first one. Very interesting in terms of, in my personal case, because I identified with that place, but not really an article if you think about it. I would maybe take an aside here to say that it's maybe important to think how schools were working back then, and we've been talking about where we were 20 years ago and where we are nowadays, and how YRE are supposed to be ambassadors to YRE. And this is perhaps relevant. Back then, there's no question absolutely that you were expected to disseminate what you were doing. We were talking about the very early days of the internet and the fact that for the first time in the history of mankind, we could actually, like this, make a message arrive all the way across several borders and share our thoughts. And so it was substantial that my school, and Margarida will correct me if I'm wrong, was one of the very first high schools in Portugal to have access to a BBS, BBS means?
Bulletin Board Service.
Okay, which was the precursor to the internet. So universities had access to that, and you had to connect to a university, which in the case of our school was in the south bank of Lisbon. So you would connect to their hub, and from there they would connect you to Europe. And I remember very well.
So one quote, the main difficulty is getting connected to the server. Each school needs a computer, a modem, and a telephone line to be connected to the nearest university and from there to reach Copenhagen through the data lines.
Sounds very complex, right? Picture this, and it's quite interesting. This has happened to me several times in my life. I've worked in development in Africa, and I've actually been in some villages that were connected to the internet for the first time, just in the last couple of years. But my first experience was with my Lycos email. I had the Lycos email. I'm sure some of the younger ones of you probably don't even know what Lycos is. Lycos was one of the very first email companies. It's still around. It's now owned by an Indian company. And I still keep my Lycos email. The first time I connected, there were about 30 students around me over my shoulders as I typed to Denmark. And people were very curious about the fact that you could type things that would appear there and then someone would type back at you. This was quite groundbreaking. So we were ambassadors, not just in the sense that we were communicating with kids in other places, but also in the sense that back home we were expected to, after our missions, go and talk to the media and go and talk to our local community and go and do workshops in the school and go in local contests. So this was part and parcel of what the entire process was like. It did not stop with the mission, it continued after that, right? Now, fast forward to the third magazine, and we are at 1996, 1997, and, oh, I'm sorry, on the second magazine there's something very interesting here. The missions in, I think Margarita showed a picture of it, but...
In the central pages, isn't it? It's yellow pages where you find the missions, isn't it?
There we go. There we go. Ah, yes. So I was not the first reporter, because there was another boat before my boat, and that was the
Professor Georges Petit.
Professor Georges Petit oceanographical ship in the Riviera.
In Nice. In Nice.
And this is where the first young reporters were.
Terrible boats for being seasick.
But then we get to magazine number 3. So this is 1996, 1997. We are now 3 years into the project. The internet is kind of faster. We're still on DSL, right? So it's still pretty slow, but faster. And in here we start to talk about a bunch more missions. The interesting thing about this magazine is, number one, the articles have changed. It's not students saying, I am from the school such and such in Marrakesh or in Lisbon or in Copenhagen. It's actually starting as an article. There's an evolution within 3 years in which they're actually talking about scientific projects, they're transmitting knowledge, they're passing a story. And then you get to the center pages, and what we see is Mission Nyanga, so sending students to Africa, Senegal, I think, no? Was it? Then we have another one in
La Réunion.
In Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean. Then Cannes. Then we have, is this Portugal?
Nuclear waste.
No,
this was in France.
This is France.
One of the most fascinating missions going in the heart of the nuclear power plants. This is most exotic than any Arctic expedition, I can tell you.
And then we had in the same year an expedition to Vietnam and another one to Svalbard. So it was supposed to be to Quebec. Somehow it ended up being in Svalbard. And I will tell you that when we discussed that parents maybe wouldn't let kids go in these days because, you know, it's a crazy world and the media out there scare parents and they don't want to let kids go. Well, you know what, 20 years ago was the same thing. I believe Margarita and Clara had to intervene with my parents to let me go. And eventually they decided not to let me go to Vietnam because somehow they associated Vietnam with a war. And so they ended up letting me go to the Arctic. And 20 years later, I still love 20 degrees below. And finally, we have a newsletter here. And keeping...
I have something to say about the magazine. Shall I say it?
Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that is quite interesting about the vocabulary of the project, I said that the word adventure had been kind of disappearing. And there is a new word that we were never using in this beginning of the project that I heard a lot today. It is competition. Because you are doing this article competition, which is a very efficient way, I can imagine, to push all the young reporters in the standard of their productions. But the key word at that time was rather cooperation, and in particular international cooperation. And that meant, I mean, the ideal of it was how you make pupils from different countries working on similar issues and local inquiries. How do you make them cooperate with each other and exchange information and eventually produce something together? And this magazine was one of the things in terms of cooperation we were quite proud of, because they were done by the schools in turn. It was pretty, I mean, it was quite a task, but we would go, the national operators, in one school for a couple of days. It would take a couple of days, and all the schools in the network knew that during these days this magazine was done, and they had, if they wanted to be published, they had to send their material to that school, and there they were being put together and laid out and all that, and leading to this magazine. So this producing a joint magazine with materials from different countries was one of the ways of cooperation. And I will continue on cooperation after.
And there's actually something else I forgot about this magazine. This is an interesting issue also because it happened in 1997. 1997 is a year before the Universal Expo in Lisbon, which was themed The Oceans, Heritage for the Future. And it was a very particular expo. It was one of the most successful expos in the world so far. It has become a center of excellence. It has changed the city. It has created a new centrality in the city. And it was at the time the biggest brownfields reconversion project in the world. It remains one of the biggest. Not only that, it has become a center of excellence. The expo has been transformed into a private company, first a state company and now a private company. And the funny thing is that there's an article here written, I think, by the same school about how the expo was changing two rivers in Lisbon, so the Tagus that flows mainly through the city, and a feeder river that used to be one of the most polluted on the continent and was completely cleaned up so that, well, it was an expo about the oceans, right? So you needed to do something. We actually have dolphins back now, so it's sort of cool. The interesting thing is that many years later, working as a reporter, I actually went to Lisbon and took a delegation of 50 Chinese landscape architects to visit this place. And that same expo has consulted with the Chinese Shanghai Expo. They have become such an example in terms of brownfield reconversion that urban renewal projects all around the world actually continue to flock there to evaluate what's been done there and to transplant it to somewhere else. So that was an interesting point here. The other thing that I wanted to say about this last newsletter, and I think I still have a little minute.
Yeah.
Yes, 2 minutes. Well, this newsletter, and this is the last one that we have from the archives, has two interesting aspects here. Number one, the themes of the young reporters at the time. So there were clusters of information. We were not focusing just on garbage or just on forests or just on the oceans. There were, in the same year, things being worked on agriculture, cities, coastline, energy, waste, and water. And there were schools aggregated to each of those themes depending on what was local to them, what was relevant to their local context. At the same time, we had, in this year, missions in Anatolia, Turkey, in Oeiras, Portugal, in Horus, Denmark, in Dublin and County Kerry in Ireland, in Rome, in Saint-Étienne. So, as a young reporter, I recognize that we have rationalized the missions. We have democratized the missions. They are now cheaper. They are accessible to more kids. And I was very skeptical, and Margarita has always told me that, believe me, the kids continue to take the same out of it. And even though our mission was pretty spectacular, I mean, we saw the kids in Lisbon just a few months ago, and it's true that it doesn't really matter where you go. When you are that age, you are very impressionable. And so you could send kids to, I don't know, to County Kerry in Ireland, And it's still pretty darn impressive, right? Nothing against County Kerry. Now, most importantly, the back page of this thing gives a definition of a new job that had just been created at FEE. It's called a cybrarian, because we were in the cyberspace finally, so we created the figure of the cybrarian. And it defines it. It says, in connection with the web is capitalized, a cybrarian is appointed by FEE, hereforth, to advise on internet-related resources. The cybrarian responds to the needs of the YRE teachers and students in terms of tools and access to information. He will facilitate the use of the internet in general by guiding, filtering, animating, summarizing, annotating. 10 years ago, 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah, but this position did not last so long because fortunately these technologies became more and more easy and familiar for everyone. But the important thing I would like to sum up after going through this history and this press review of the newsletters, the founding documents, the magazines, is that in fact, I would like to emphasize the political dimension of this project. It's a project for transforming society, from the widely non-sustainable dominant model which is still prevailing and which you can see, for example, every time you look at the curve of the greenhouse gas emissions and our incapacity to reverse this curve so far. And so the political project behind is ready to reverse this kind of trends and curves. And this transformative objective is starting first with the individual. This project is investing in the capacity of individuals to undertake personal transformation. And personal transformation is what, is not a matter of knowledge or information. It's a matter of experiencing something different, something new, meaningful to your life, and creating this situation of experiencing was one of the purposes of the whole chain of activities, starting with the mission somehow as the most advanced way to offer a transformative experience to the learner, down to these local investigations by the schools themselves, because the finality, after all, is not just to transform a few pupils taken here and there and sent to mission. The finality is to transform the way that teaching is done, so that those unsustainable thinking models that are still prevailing in our brains are replaced by real, authentic, sustainable thinking. So the key to this transformative process is, to my opinion, interaction and inquiry. Actually, the power of journalism and inquiry is that it activates interaction with inspiring people and in inspiring places. So one example, I'd now like to ask you, Pedro, about personal transformation and being sent to a very inspiring place. What difference did that make to your life and to your values and your capacity to act positively on the world?
So I go back to the idea that when you are, let's say, between 15 and 17, you are at a very impressionable age. And so pretty much everything is pretty cool. As long as they send you away from your parents for a week, it's pretty cool. But of course, this was not just what happened in our case. All the very first missions were all pretty spectacular. They didn't just send you to some mountain lodge in the country next door. No, they sent you the furthest they could send you. without driving your parents crazy. They put you in minus 35 temperatures. They threw you on a boat that was wintering on an ice sheet. They threw you in the Vietnamese jungle. They threw you in the mangroves in Senegal.
We were a bit excessive.
Of course, these things cost a lot of money, and so they're not replicable. They're not practical for nowadays use. But back then, what they were really interesting experiences that created a lot of very strong impressions. And it's important to say before I tell you about my own experience, and perhaps I won't say too much because I'll keep some for the next session, but think about just a few reporters that I know. I mean, there's one of the other Portuguese kids that is now a pretty darn awesome entomologist that is kind of crisscrossing the world. 1 week is in Madagascar, the next week is in the Amazon, the next week is in Nepal.
While he's speaking, I just circulate these pictures from that Arctic mission that Pedro was sent to.
Then there's another one of the Portuguese students who was actually in the mission before me, became a journalist. There's a student that I actually coordinated in a mission that Margarida organized and invited me to be a teacher coordinator or a student coordinator that has become a pretty big BBC reporter. She's not a BBC reporter anymore. She moved on with her life, but for quite a few years she was a pretty big deal and she would be on TV all the time. Then there's the colleague that went to Svalbard with me. And she not only had 4 babies, but she also became an ICT for communication, a technology and communication teacher at Aarhus University with a Stanford PhD and so on. And so it's pretty impressive. And you look at it, it's technology and it's communication. So you can clearly create threads that go all the way from that very first mission to the decisions that you make in your life and where you end up. And the other guy that was with us who became a sustainable farmer, so he's not doing that anymore, but up until 2 years ago he was an organic farmer in southern France. And so what I'm getting at here is that something happens there that kind of changes you. You become aware of whatever issues are relevant at the time. And of course, you might or not do things that are directly connected with that, but the overall experience kind of changes the way you perceive things around you. The way you communicate. I mean, I've been working with international agencies for the last 10 years, and remote communication, which started right there, is part of my daily life. Every time someone asks me if I'm comfortable with telecommuting, come on, I've been doing that for 20 years. It's the only way I commute. I don't commute in any other way. What about languages? Well, I continue to speak whatever language on a daily basis. I speak a bunch of them, and I can go from one to the other. So that's, again, part of what we were taught to do in the 1990s, part of that moment of teaching you that in order to integrate, you need to cooperate, you need to be understood, you need to interact. And most importantly, there's, from the personal point of view, from the personal point of view, there's something that I call the foundational moment, right? Every time I think about my past, every time I think about kind of sequences of decisions, a tree of decisions if you want, I go back to this and I kind of call Svalbard my moment zero. It's the aha moment. It's the moment when you don't realize it back then, of course. You realize it much later that something happened there and something changed you. And of course, as a 17-year-old, you're too foolish to realize that. But you come to realize it eventually, that there was something very unique. And I believe that this is probably common to all the missions. I believe that you will find kids that have the same sort of impact from all the missions. So the missions continue to be, in my opinion, one of the crucial aspects of YRE. Not just because you send kids away, but because those kids come back changed and they actually effect change in others and in the environment around them. And by environment, I mean not the environment, but in your surroundings. You become an ambassador de facto. And I think that's perhaps the most important personal trait that you take out of that.
So I think we are reaching the end of this press review, but at the end of the press review we have also books that should be highlighted a bit. And there was a little bit of books, and here together with me I have this antique publication by the Council of Europe Press about the ozone project. So if you like to learn about what was before YRE, there was this monography published by the Council of Europe, I mean, telling everything about it. The thing is, I have no idea whether other copies exist anywhere, but at least you have one. Okay, at least there are these two ones. And then here we have this quite interesting publication, which is called the Young Reporters for the Environment Guidebook. You were discussing about manuals and guidebooks, and in this case you'll be happy to learn that we have a teacher's one and a pupil's one.
We are opening open doors.
So apart maybe for the IT component of it, which is a bit outdated, maybe some of the contents of these publications might be of inspiration to you. And these ones, I think that there is a stock of them somewhere. But where is a good question.
France.
In France you have them. Okay, that would be the place here. And in English versions too?
I don't think so.
You know, only French ones? Okay, but they exist in English too. So, and there I like to give one few quotes again as conclusion. There is a very interesting beginning which tries to state what are the educational goals of the YRE project. And I see that educational goals, also clarifying goals, was one of the bullet points of one of the earlier discussion today. And so you can find here the work of, this was done collectively with several teachers, actually, YRE teachers in these years. So, understanding environmental issues and development problems, first of all. So that's the goals for the pupils, okay? The educational goals for the participating children. Acquiring an active vision of citizenship. Adopting a critical approach to information. Acquiring scientific and technological literacy. Becoming able to take part in the construction of a multicultural Europe. Learning teamwork. Learning to communicate and to disseminate. Learning to learn, very important one. Getting acquainted with the main computer tools. Today that would probably be less an objective. Getting to know the professional world. And all these items are then detailed into sub-objectives. So there have been quite a lot of work done by this group of teachers in defining the goals. And I like to read, to see how kind of maybe too ambitious we were. But at least clear in the intention. And it's interesting in this document also, you also find some evaluation facts based on some surveys that were done over a number of schools at that moment. And there is a few figures that I'd like to share with you. In 1998, so there was 390 questionnaires coming from Cyprus, France, Ireland, Italy and Turkey, which were analyzed. And these questionnaires showed that 86% of the students think that they have improved their teamwork skills. That was the highest impact to their eyes, even before environmental issues, that was teamwork skills. No, because 90%, so okay, environment was first. 90% declared to be more aware of the environmental problems. 76% say they can explain them better to others. 74% think they have improved their capacity to write. 51% say their behavior has changed. 49% think they have raised environmental awareness of people around them. And 28% think they have been able to change the behaviors around them, which is, of course, the ultimate and the most difficult target to reach. But that kind of figures are important to share. In hearing the discussions this morning, and I was speaking about the change in the vocabulary with the word cooperation, the word competition, maybe I'd like just to give a few food for future discussions among the YRE. I think you would enjoy a lot to kind of reactivate the connection with the scientific community, which I see a bit, maybe not lost, but at least downscaled in the projects. You will love to reactivate the power of science to stimulate questioning and creativity and new thinking. This is the connecting pupils with scientists is extremely powerful, and scientists are really open to that. After YRE, during 11 years, I was in charge of connecting the climate change research in Europe with secondary education, and we've done a lot of projects connecting them together, and it's really worth. And about cooperation, okay, I gave the example of the magazines that were one example of cooperation. But there is one thing that we never really managed to do 15 years ago because the tools were too scarce. But now you have the tools, so I would like you to challenge. I would like to challenge you to succeed into that. Is simply to have some of your schools produce cooperative articles making use of information provided by schools from other countries. That's to say, you are investigating, for example, waste reduction in your municipality, and maybe you can make a Skype meeting and interview pupils in Italy. No, Italy is not in the project, is it? Okay. Anyway, the communication tools today could open new realistic ways to produce real European or international reports, and maybe this could even become a new category in the YRE competition. That one possibility for a prize would be the prize given to the school who is able to integrate into their article some components from here, and we have 2 minutes left, and you need one. Yeah, I think I can give the floor to you, and I will have a concluding one.
Okay. So I just have a little thing here that I wanted to show you, but before I do that, this newsletter, this is the last one I have, is 1998. There's 10 countries in YRE 1998, and there's 2 names here that kind of deserve a round of applause. There's Mr. Michael Yeridis. There's Mr. Çelik Tarinci. And in absentia, there's Miss Patricia Oliver, who's not here, but she's represented by a friend. She's still around. And well, on the airplane to Romania, I was reading The Economist, and lo and behold, what I found in The Economist. Those guys have a name. They're called Calanus glacialis. They're a species of krill that exists in the Arctic, and this is what we were researching 20 years ago. The Economist finally caught on with what we were doing 20 years ago. Right? You know, we know the scientific name of these little bugs. And they're still doing, by the way, you measure how many of these are in the water, and you can tell if currents are going one way or the other, if the oceans have warmed up or not, and so on and so forth.
And I want to conclude with one word, which is revolution. And we have different revolutions happening. We have the revolution of freedom in Europe and the building up of the European Union. And I mean, saying this in Bucharest back 20 years ago is really meaning something very, very strong. And I was not in Romania, I don't know what exactly, I have no personal experience of it, but I had the personal experience of Riga. Sorry?
25 years.
Yeah, 25, but then, I mean, right, the revolution itself was 25 years ago, but...
And took place here, where we are.
In this room.
In this location.
In this location, yeah.
Yeah.
In the University Square.
So there have been this revolution, and then I want to speak about the technological revolution who was helping us with the communications found, and I just want to read it to you very, very quickly so that you get an idea of how things were working. He's writing to a teacher with whom they try to connect. So I would appreciate if you would help me try out a new method of communication. It's a method where you should be connected to a Danish conference system. I will try to tell how I do it, and I hope you will be able to do it at your place. What I do here is that I use a telecommunication program called Telix. Then I call a telephone number that we call the main entrance to the computers of the University of Copenhagen. The number is 45 93 83 00. I hope that you would have a similar number connecting to your computer. I use 2400 baud and 81. Then when I am connected, I press on space twice, and I press X for command mode. Then I get the sign uni c/6.100. Then I write the IP number to our machine. And this number you should give in your end too. Then I'm connected to Sun OS, Unix. Then it says login, and I write LFU. Then it says password, and I write terminal. Then it says ident, and I write 4224599. Then it says group, and I write ozone. Then it says code, and I write ozone. Then you can write my name, Eric Dam, and my password, 0063. Please do not make a new password, just press return. Then you are in the conference system, and you can write deltag ozone, and you should see a short notice. And then you are able to communicate with us. This was a bit before, it was still at the ozone project time, it was in 1991. But we have the revolution of freedom, we have the revolution of technology, these ones are done. And now it's time for the revolution of education. And this is the one that you are all doing, and congratulations. And I would like to finish with a small personal gift. So I would like to offer to Gosia, because you offer me a great gift by inviting me here. And this is. Can you explain this? The meaning of me? Okay, it's not the right day to do it. I should wait for tomorrow. Is that right? To use this?
No problem.
I can do it a bit in advance.
Yeah.
Because this is the Romanian tradition.
Yes.
That you said.
White,
But it starts from now.
red.
No problem, it starts from now.
It's up from tomorrow, I think.
You can give.
So thanks a lot for. So Radio YRE, thanks for your participation.
Thank you.
And you can put all those papers on one of the tables and.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Or maybe two.